if a family knew that at least there was some kind of support with, you know, the city or the county or somebody's gonna come to my aid if this kid's extended family comes and terrorizes my, you know, my family. And that when, I mean, we have a population of kids and families in this community where that could very well be the case. So people don't just wanna say, I'll be the Good Samaritan, without some kind of backup.
Right, exactly, yeah.
I was gonna say, I differ a little bit in only being 16 and over. I think the runaway girl presents within the 13 to 15-year-old bracket.
Yeah.
And in this case, there's issues as far as finding this short-term period to have mediation or support from the county for services. In the meantime, the encouragement is usually to live with friends, extended family. And I had one gal who was lucky enough to get into the women's shelter at 15 because her parents locked her out, and she had mental illness issues that prevented her from really being acceptable in many other situations. But she hooked up with a much older male criminal. He beat her up, and finally she had a placement.
So I think one of the things you have to think about in starting services for homeless youth is kind of sustainability and how do you document what needs you're getting at. So when I think about homeless youth, the problem is there is this arc of homelessness, and it includes with youth, it includes everything from recent runaway youth to episodic youth to street dependent youth. Does that make sense? And the interventions vary depending on who you're trying to serve. With recent runaways, you're talking about a bridge model, which is family reunification or kinship care options, emergency shelter short-term. Intermediate youth, you're talking about longer-term case management services, transitional independent living, you know, those kind of services. And with street-dependent youth, oftentimes they come with multiple disabilities, huge backgrounds with trauma and sexual exploitation. They're probably going to need long-term care. Does that make sense? That they're probably going to transition into adulthood as disabled adults. Is kind of the reality that you see. When you're looking at a house, I think the problem is that most communities like yourself around the nation that want to try to do something with homeless youth start with this concept of, oh, we just need a shelter and then everything will be fine. But the reality is, okay, so I got a kid in a shelter bed now, 30 days passes, he has no income, he doesn't have a job, there's no family to go back to, where does he go? Where does she go? And then you don't have any resources on the back end of it, nor have you really done, I don't think from what I'm hearing today, a sufficient job in identifying what are the core priority populations you're trying to serve. In my opinion, there's a huge difference between homeless children with family, because you're not going to take even some 16-year-old and take them away from mom and dad and put them in a youth housing program, because why would they do that when they're part of a family context, even though the family's in crisis? You're talking about unaccompanied homeless youth that have probably very little kinship care options, that need kind of transitional help getting into adulthood.
And I would say that that's what our target thought would be. That definitely wouldn't be, you know, for us in the home would not be families, because that's not the need where we can't in one home serve, you bring one family in.
And I think the challenge for Rochester is that you have this limited pool of resources, and you want to do something, but the problem is that you could spend a lot of money rehabbing and continuing operating one structure, which is going to help 5 kids for 30 days. So since you're really serving maybe about 40 or 50 kids a year, and you have probably a lot more than that need services. I would really encourage you to think not about structure, but actually talk about relationship building, because adolescence is about a period of time when they're actually trying to build relationships with people, and they will access services when they trust who they're working with. As we all know, they need to be in a trusting relationship. I would think more about doing a community outreach and data collection process at the beginning of this whole initiative, because you need to identify in a better way who are the youth that we need to serve, what are the barriers that exist, and what are their age categories, and what are their typologies. If we start to identify those areas, you can design specific interventions that work with each one. So if you're seeing a lot of 15-year-olds or 16-year-olds that are running away, then that's more about family reunification, and it is more about a shelter and counseling with families. If you're talking about 17, 18, 19-year-olds who can't go back to home, does that make sense? And there's not an option there, then you're talking about transitional housing, because they're just needing about a year or 2 of support, and then they're going to be on a trajectory of positive work. But if you're talking about kids that have been traumatized through prostitution, have multiple mental health or chemical addiction issues, you're probably not going to solve that in a 12-month housing program. Does it make sense? You could even create this house and say, well, we're going to house 6 people transitionally, and after 12 months, the question is, well, now they're 21-year-old adults that still have mental health disabilities. Are they really going to be independent, or do they need permanent supportive housing? if you had a community-based outreach program that was able to identify youth in a different way and begin to use host home models in the community and scattered site housing instead of thinking about a structure, you could start to identify where the needs are across your continuum, and then start to plug in the holes with housing resources as you go along. I just think, I'm an outsider, so I'm not from here, I'm from St. Paul, and I don't pretend to know everything about Rochester, but I would hate to see you use hundreds of thousands of dollars in available federal or state resources to do just one house with 5 beds, when you could do case management services with 3 or 4 community outreach workers that have mental health training to work with multiple families and youth, identify the issues better, and begin to design housing programs that fit different categories, because you're gonna need that continuum eventually, and you're not gonna be able to sustain that unless you actually document it through data. Am I talking too much?
No,
So I would just suggest you think about this as kind of a movement to get better data and better accountability, because then funders will come to the table once you've been able to identify, okay, we want to serve 16, 18-year-olds, or we're going to serve the 19 to 21-year-olds with this kind of model of housing. And then you can think about the housing. But I think you're going to spend a lot of time at the beginning if you only think about this as a structured house.